Okay. Okay, we're on Samach Amid Bey. We're about 20 lines down or so. We're going to start with the Gemara Ravina Omar. So we concluded last week by saying that the ribis and neshech are really one and the same. There's two sides of the same coin, but you can't have one without the other. And we learned from Gzeira Shava that it says by the borrower, neshech, it says the word neshech. It does not say by the malva the word neshech. So we infer that just like the word neshech appears in one and in the other, and in one it includes that the borrower is over neshech if he participates. So even though we don't see that by the lender, the word neshech b'chol, therefore the word neshech alone, corresponding to the neshech of the borrower, also corresponds to the neshech of the lender. And then we see that when you lend money or food, that in all cases it is a isur of neshech and tarbis. Because remember, the whole question was, we see it by one and not by the other. So if we don't see it, how do we know that it applies to food? If it's neshech b'chol, if it's neshech sef. So that's how we infer, since the neshech by the borrower also refers to the food, therefore the neshech by the lender has to apply by the food as well. So that's how we left the Gemara, that everything applies completely all around. Now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. Remember, a pasuk is obviously better than Gzeira Shava, but we said that we didn't have a pasuk, so therefore it's implied through the Gzeira Shava. So Ravina now wants to come and say that there is a pasuk. You don't have to come on to the Gzeira Shava. Why? Because there's a pasuk. Ravina Omer, Lo neshech ba'ochel lo ribis b'kesef tzrich yikra. We don't need a Gzeira Shava to tell us neshech ba'ochel and ribis b'kesef, because we see it from a pasuk. What's the pasuk? Because the pasuk says, so he's saying the if the pasuk would have said if it would have said your money you cannot give with neshech and your food b'marbis, if it had said this, then he's saying, okay, now I understand that they're separate. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk actually says as kaspacha lo sitin lo b'neshech u'b'marbis lo sitin achlecha. So let's pay attention. Your money you can't use b'neshech and marbis for food. So he says, if you would have separated out the words, the iksiv as kaspacha lo sitin b'neshech, and then v'achlecha b'marbis, okay, then I would have seen that money by neshech and food is by taris. Now that it says kasper lo b'neshech u'b'marbis lo sitin achlecha, so the key is that the neshech and the marbis are side by side. And see, every nuance of the pasuk matters. So if you would have said and you would have broken it up with the word va'achlecha b'marbis, then neshech is one thing, marbis is something else. But the pasuk puts the words together as kasper lo sitin lo b'neshech uv'marbis lo sitin achlecha. So now we have a different interpretation. What's the interpretation? Kri behachi. Now we learn out as follows: as kasper lo sitin lo b'neshech uv'marbis. Right? Look at the pasuk. Your kesef, you cannot do neshech u'marbis, and then the same word b'neshech u'marbis lo sitin achlecha. The chachma here is that this pasuk is telling, you don't need Gzeira Shava tell us that neshech applies to food because it says it by the borrower and not by the lender, so we include it. the pasuk itself should have bifurcated the word neshech and marvis and said simply that kesef applies to neshech, va'achlecha b'marvis. But it doesn't say that. It says, and this is the key, as kaspecha lo sitin lo b'neshech u'b'marvis lo sitin achlecha. So Ravina says the pasuk means that your money you shouldn't use b'neshech u'b'marbis, and then again neshech u'marbis lo sitein achlecha. So the neshech and the marbis in the middle of the pasuk are doubled, one to refer to neshech and the other to refer to marbis. So with this app, Ravina, why do you have to use Xereshva? Second best. It's good, but it's a second best to a pasuk. The pasuk of Farish says that neshech and marbis apply to both money and food, right? So that's Ravina's proof. Ravina wants to come and say you can't tell me only from Xereshava that everything applies all the way around. But Pasuk Beferish wants to tell us that by using this juxtaposition of words that neshech and marbis applies to both money and food because of the way they are positioned in the pasuk. In other words, it's not happenstance accidental that the pasuk uses these words the way it does. It has a specific meaning. So that's Ravina's taina. He says, why do you say that it's Xereshava? It's a pasuk. So comes the Gemara and says, wait a minute. I understand what Ravina you're saying. You comes for the pasuk for hatana nema kamer. You have to understand, when the Tanoim learn Xereshava, you can't have an Ora come later and say, I don't like it. I'm going to remove the Xereshava and I'm going to say it's a pasuk. These are Tanoim who learned the Xereshava. So in other words, the Xereshava has some validity. So according to Ravina's pshat, that you don't need the Xereshava because the pasuk tells us, then the Hatana nema kamer. What do you do with the Tana who says that you learn it from Xereshava, nema, right? So in other words, the kasha inherently is, the Gemara already established that it was Xereshava. How can Ravina, who came later, slug up the Xereshava and says, no, it's a pasuk? In other words, we have to honor a time-honored tradition that the Tanoim, who came before the Amoraim, established the basic laws, and the Amoraim come to sort of amplify it. But the Amoraim can't come and say, I don't like it. I don't like what you said about Xereshava, so I'm gonna push away the Xereshava. That's not the way we learn. So that's the Gemara's kasha. How can you say Ravina learns it from a pasuk? What are you going to do with the Xereshava? So Ravina, to defend himself, wants to explain what you're going to do. So he says, Hachikama. Ravina is saying, this is what the Brisa said when it said the Xereshava. Ilulo nema kra. Okay. It wasn't a pasuk. So we see oftentimes that it's just a slight word that captures the whole thing. So Ravina says, no, you're right. Xereshava is very important. But if the pasuk didn't say it, then then I would agree with you that there is a Xereshava. So we need the Xereshava there as a backup if there was no pasuk. Now that there is a pasuk, Xereshava lo tzarech. This still strains a little bit because didn't the Tanoim know that? I mean, they learned Xereshava. They didn't know there was a pasuk. So you're coming to tell me that the Xereshava is valid if there's no pasuk. And that's the way Ravina wants to answer it. But the bottom line is the Tanoim knew that. So how can you justify by saying that they said there was a Xereshava if Ravina's answer is you don't need the Xereshava when there's a pasuk, and the Tanoim surely knew of the pasuk? So that remains a little bit of a kasha as to how you want to understand what the difference is here, how Ravina comes to his answer, because Ravina wants to support his view that you have a pasuk, you don't need the Xereshava. So he says, what if? If you didn't have it, it would be good. But now that we have it, so that, again, it's a little bit of a strain on the understanding of what the Gemara wants to say, because Lamaisa, there is a pasuk. Okay, so now the Gemara. All right, so that's Ravina's answer. Okay, and it's a little bit difficult. Frank the Gemara elixer shavalamali. So now that you're telling me that you're right, Xerushav is important when there isn't a pasuk. When there is a pasuk, it isn't. But now that there's a pasuk, Xerushav alamali. So, but again, the kasha is, what do you do with the Xereshava? Everybody knows. The Tanoim certainly knew that there was a pasuk. And says the Gemara, Leneshach kol davar asher yishach. It doesn't refer to neshech on money and tarbis on ochel. It refers to the last words of the pasuk. Remember, that pasuk said, "Leneshech kol davar asher yishach." After going through the neshech of kesef and the tarbis of ochel, it uses the words leneshech kol davar sheyishach. That so in other words, we wouldn't know that from a pasuk. The pasuk doesn't tell us that. So we need the gzera shava to tell us that any davar, let's say you're lending a machinery. It's not food. It's not money. It's a mamoshes. You can think of any other clothing, anything like that. How do you know that there is no? How do you know there's an isser? How do you know there's an isser? Maybe it applies to money and to food, but you don't know specifically that it applies to other things. That's when the Gzeira Shava comes in, because the pasuk doesn't cover that. So therefore he says, now I understand why the Gzeira Shava is there, even though there's a pasuk, because everybody knew there was a pasuk. Teretz is that the loikosav b'malveh, because by malveh it does not say, only by the love it says l'neshach kol davar sheyishach. So okay, so the borrower is over a lav on anything. How do we know the malva is over a lav? If the malva lends equipment to somebody, and from that there is an interest, how do you know he's over? It only said it by the borrower. Teretz is Gzera Shava, that the Gzera Shava comes to tell us that we extrapolate from the words of the borrower that the lender is equally chayiv. Because we talked about this. In principle, you can ask a question: why should the borrower be over a lav of neshech and tarbis? The lender is the one who's extracting either the pain in the case of neshech or the profit in the case of tarbis. What does the borrower have to do with that? The poor borrower, he needs the money and he needs the food. So the Torah tells us that the neshech and the marbis are such strong isurim that you should not participate in them, even if you're a needy person and you need the food. I mean, the lender, so he's obviously doesn't need it, but the borrower needs it. He needs the food. He needs the money. But in order to get the money, he has to be over a lav in the Torah. You may not take it, and you have to find another source to get your sustenance or the money or whatever it happens to be. That's the chiddush. That's the real chiddush, says the Gemara. Now we see the Gzeira Shava is, since by the borrower, the one who's more vulnerable, it says that he can't participate in neshech for anything, for other than food and money, even anything. Then with Gzeira Shava, that the malva is the same way. So,
right. Question.
Yeah.
So, just thinking about it from different aspects. I mean, I understand the idea that neshech, tarbis, etc., does apply to things other than food and other than money.
Right.
And those are sort of the classic examples, and the Torah brings them down. And there's certainly other things like you borrow, some other item that comes in quantity.
Yeah.
Like what? I'm sorry.
Utensil. You borrow utensils.
Well,
no,
not that. That's what I'm going to get to. That's the difference. So if, let's say, food, fine. And if, let's say, I borrow, a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example, but something not edible, but that still comes in bulk quantities. Sorry, what? Yeah.
Clothing?
Well, not clothing. So here's the thing. What I'm getting at, I'll jump to where I'm getting at, which is when you have something like clothing, okay, I mean, not clothing, when you have something like food, okay, I borrow a cup of sugar, maybe I should be giving back a little extra as a thank you. No, you can't. That's marbits. Fine. But if I borrow clothing. I borrow a suit, or I borrow equipment, like you're saying, I borrow your bulldozer or your lawnmower or whatever. If I return it, I'm not going to give you an extra, 1/10 of a lawnmower. There's no such thing. I'm not going to give you your suit back and say, here's an extra shirt. So there really isn't any kind of increase in that. What there might be, and I think these laws to some degree cover it, is you might say, oh, here's some money. But the reality is that you don't need, if you want to simply rent that suit, I mean, people rent tuxedos, okay, or people rent bulldozers or whatever. You don't need anything special to say, oh, I'm gonna, do this whole thing, the heter iska, this, that, what, blah, blah, blah. No. You, you say, I want to borrow this for a day, and here I'll give you $20 as a rental fee, and you're done. So my guess, but maybe you can explain this, is that this would only apply if you didn't go ahead and say, let's just make this a rental. If it's under the impression of giving something totally free as a loan, but then you hand back some money afterwards, that's where you run into a problem. Is that right? Because you wouldn't hand back 5% of a widget,
Yeah. So Menashe, a good example is, let's say you have a gemach.
Right.
And the gemach has wedding gowns,
there you go.
and it lends wedding gowns to kalas and to others who need them. Okay, so the gemach itself offers itself. It's a free loaner. You need, we will help you. Okay, that's no problem. Now, if the gemach says, yeah, but we need to clean it. We need to clean it between your use and someone else's use. That wouldn't be considered ribis. That wouldn't be considered neshech, because it's a fee that goes to helping make the gemach be a free loan. Right. So in other words, yes, you're nuancing and you're saying, okay, but you're not getting back, oh, I give you a gown, you got to give me a gown plus $10. Okay, you make out in advance, and remember, this can be done through the heteiska, or you don't need one actually for the gemach.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is that if it's a rental, gemach normally free, and the idea, yes, like you said, to include a certain amount to cover the cleaning makes total sense.
The gemach shouldn't have to take the responsibility of paying for the clean.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how it would become. That's kol davar is how that's how, and the same with a lawnmower. You lend a lawnmower. You got to put some gas in it. I mean, the gas does
right. So maybe there's a good example that, and then we think about rental cars in general. It's if it had a 3/4 of a tank, you got to return it with 3/4 of a tank or whatever. So if I borrow, but there's a payment and it's easy. That's a rental, it's a contract. Great.
Right.
If I borrow your lawnmower, there would probably be a reasonable understanding that if you loaned it to me with a full tank of gas, I should return it with a full tank of gas. There's nothing extra and everything's great. But if you loaned it to me with no gas in it, or almost nothing, and I went ahead and filled it up but used very little, arguably then that extra gas, unless it was arranged in advance to say, here's the deal, that could be ribis of some sort.
Right. So it's interesting, right? Because by gad, we've all done this. We've all been in that situation. I rent a car. I like to have the car full of gas, and I return it full of gas because I can't know that I'm returning a half a tank or 3/4 of a tank. So they tell me on the rental paper, you have a half a tank. Bring it back with a half a tank. Fine. What am I going to do? I'm going to pump gas and keep seeing that I'm up to a half a gas. I pump gas. Now, if I wind up with 3/4 of a tank, that's not ribis because he didn't ask for it. I didn't ask that you give me another 1/4 of a tank, right? When you're dealing with something that the accuracy of which is hard to determine, then you can't say it's
right,
ribis.
But also in that case, it's more than that. It's not only he didn't ask for it, he said, just give me this. You're not giving him that extra 1/4 tank as a thank you. You're just giving it because you're just trying to cover yourself.
That's exactly right. So that would be not ribis b'chlal, because there you're really dealing in sort of, how do I know I'm giving it back the same amount? I'm not looking to do him a favor, but it turns out that way. So I think that's not really the issue. But when you talk about I'm borrowing something, I'm going to return it to you, the use itself takes some toll Okay, depreciation, for instance, on the equipment. So I'm not going to pay you for the depreciation. To oil it, I do so give you back what I got. Remember, my use of it depreciates the gas, lowers the gas, lowers the oil, lowers everything. So to be fair, to give you back what you gave me, I have to add the things. Then we're even. If you're not getting a windfall from me, we're even. And as long as we're even, then you can't say that there was any kind of neshech or tarbis or anything like that. So he's saying the Gezerah Shava applies now to things other than food and money, wherein one might argue, okay, so maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't apply. So he wants to say, no, the same rules apply. But as we see in cases like in the case of food, it's an edible. You eat it. It's not here anymore. You just have to give them back. If I borrowed an apple, I give you back an apple. Okay. Am I going to speculate that I gave you back a nicer apple? I gave you an apple. I mean, it's not there. But when it comes to items that are loaned, then we say that, right, you give him back the item. You don't want to amplify it and say, with a thank you, I'm going to give you something more than you gave me. So that's where the Gezerah Shava comes in, because the pasuk doesn't deal with it. Therefore, Ravina is correct. There is a pasuk, and the Gezerah Shava only comes to add the very end of the pasuk where it talks about Chol Davar, which would otherwise not be something we would understand. Okay? All right. So let's look at Rashi. The Rashi here. Ravina omalo neshech ba'ochel v'ribis b'kesef tzricha kar, right? Lemigmer b'malve min alove de begufo kosi. In other words, it's inherent in the pasuk. In other words, it's inherent. We don't need the Gezerah Shava because the pasuk tells us that, right? It says it very clearly. For Tana nema kamer. So we ask the kasha, what does the Tana do with the Gezerah Shava if you have a pasuk? Here's the Amora. Ravina argues on a Tana of our principle of learning is that the older the generation, the more established is their edict. So therefore, a newer generation can only come to interpret, but not to conflict. So if Ravina is going to come and say, what do you do? I don't need a Gezerah Shava, I have a pasuk. That's a problem, because he's an Amora. In other words, even though that we nishma b'l'shneim means that we hear both points. And now the Gezerah Shava we don't need. So the Gezerah Shava would be something that clearly we would want to use. But you only want to use it when you need it. If you don't need the Gezerah Shava, right? He says, if there wasn't a pasuk, then I would learn the Gezerah Shava, because the Gezerah Shava is a very valid way of learning, right? But now that there is a pasuk, we don't need it. Lama li lav berivis. Oh, okay. So that's the end of the Rashi. So in other words, so we come to a conclusion that the pasuk is what guides us as far as neshech and marbis, and therefore we can be clear on how we learn it out. We have a Gezerah Shava to fit in the last part of the pasuk, which says only by the love and not by the malve. And again, I raised the question, by the love, it strains the mind a little bit, because this love is vulnerable. Yet the Torah tells us the neshech al davar asher yishach. By the borrower, it says to include everything. Therefore, we need the Gezerah Shava to tell us that applies to the lender as well. All right, so here's where the Gemara ends that discussion. Now we pick up on a different discussion, because now that we understand ribis is, we have a different kasha. There is a Amarava. There is an established principle that the Torah establishes a losas, a lav, on certain items. You can't do this, you can't do that. So the Gemara is going to ask, it seems that there's a number of lavin that come from the same source. Why do you have to repeat them? Now, if you tell me there is a lav that you can't eat basar b'chalav, and there is a lav that you can't have shatnes, one has nothing to do with the other. Okay, I understand. You create a lav for one and a craft another. But Omar Rava, Lomadi de Kosav Rachmona, why does the Torah say lav beribis, lav begezel, and lav ba'oino? We just got through learning a great deal about ono. And what is ono? Ono is fraud. Okay, you fraudulently make a deal, and you have a windfall from that. That's not gezel. It's not gezel. It's not ribis. So we have three distinct categories. Frank the Gemara, why can't we learn it all out from one? And Gemara is going to explain in a minute. In other words, you have different categories. Why don't you learn it all out from one? What do they have in common? Because at the end of the day, you're deceiving somebody and taking something from someone that is not appropriate. Gezel, okay. I know, same thing. And ribis also. Now, we understand, and Gemara is going to explain that there are nuances to each which makes them different. But in the common denominator, you're taking somebody's property. So why is that not enough of a line that we can pull to all three, and without having the Torah repeat? Because remember, the Torah repeats, the Torah doesn't repeat. If it says it, then it has to stand on its own. So that's the Gemara's kasha. How does it stand on its own? Zok the Gemara tzrich. That no, you have to have all three because each one teaches us something important. What it is. If the Torah would just tell us ribis, which we understand, then I would say mishum de chidishu. You know what's about ribis? Ribis, is voluntary. Both parties are sort of equal in a way because you don't have to borrow from somebody, right? You don't have to. So we're standing kind of equal, and the Torah says with a concept that no, you're not. That if you're standing equal and he needs something from you, then afilu beloiver asa rachmana. That again, what we said before, that the chiddush is that even the lover is asa. It's one thing for the malva to be asa, but by ribis we see that the lover is asa. So that is something that the lav of ribis tells us that the others don't tell us, right? Because by gezel, what is gezel? Gezel is I forcefully take something from you. You, the victim, have no isser. You didn't do anything improper. You were the subject of a robbery, of a gzela. The same with oino. What is oino? Oino is fraud where the person doesn't realize he's being overcharged by 1/6. Am I participating in that? No, because I don't know. So in other words, ribis gives us a chiddush that when you know something is improper, you're over a lav. I would never have thought that. I never would have thought that. So therefore, ribis is a chiddush. Now, v'ikos of Rachmana lav begezel. So it can't say just ribis because it would exclude the other two. Now, what about gezel? V'ikos of Rachmana lav begezel. If the Torah would say, you know what? Let's have gezel. We'll know ono and ribis. Says the Gemara, no. Mishun debal korcha. What separates gezel from the others? Because you force the person. I'm not forcing you to borrow something from me, right? And neither am I forcing you to buy something from me which inherently has a no. I'm not twisting your hand. This is a arm's length transaction. It just so happens that I'm charging you more and you don't know it. But it's not something that you are, quote unquote, sort of victimized. You don't know. B'chlal, you don't know. Therefore, you can't say Gezel and learn the other two out, because Gezel incorporates within it a victimization, that a person is being victimized where the other two are not. All right, so those two can't be the sort of the Musa Haskell for what we learn the others. Now, Avalano Emalo, why don't we say that we have the halacha of Ainah, and we'll know the other two as well? Says the Gemara, Mishul the Yada the Mochel, because Onah has within it, as we said before, it's defined as I don't know that I'm being defrauded. In the case of Ribis, I know what I'm doing. You're lending me $100, I'm giving you 110. In the case of Gezel, I know what I'm doing. I was victimized. In other words, they are on the surface clearly what's going on here. I know is the only one of the three, which is kind of like, it's surreptitious. I mean, I don't know the marketplace, so I don't know that I'm overpaying. I've had that. We've all had that. We overpay for something that we have no clue what should be the right price. So, says the Gemara, therefore, you can't use Oino as the basis, and that's why you have to have all three psukim, each lav separately, because each lav is distinctive and teaches us something that the others would not teach us. Okay, so the Gemara now. Okay, so we've established that we need all three psukim. Why? Because each one alone can't carry the other two. Now the Gemara takes a different angle. Okay, you're telling me you have each one separate. Chada mehada lo asya. So why can't we learn Teisa Chada B'Tarte? Let's learn 2 out of 3. Again, the Gemara's intention here is, why do you need 3? So it says, you know why you need? Because each one is a standalone. So the Gemara now wants to try to interpret that if you had 2 out of 3, it would cover it. That's what the Gemara is going to try to say. So 2 out of 3 should be good, and the third one you don't need. At least take one away so that you don't have all 3. So that's the Gemara's kasha. We see you can't learn one from the other. But let's learn 2, and then the third one will be superfluous, and we won't need it. So now the Gemara is going to go into try to explain to us what 2 would exclude the third. Says the Gemara, Hi Tatesi. Okay, which 2 are we talking about? So the Gemara says, Lo lifta rachmana la beribis. The Torah should not write ribis, only write gezela and ainah. V'teise mehanach, and I would learn out from the other 2. Why? Ma lahanach shekain shaloi midas. So now the Gemara is going to say, no, you can't do that, because these 2, shekain shaloi midas, when you rob somebody, you don't ask for permission, right? When you do oinah, you're not telling him, Ruvain, I'm selling you this, but I'm doubling the price. You don't do that. So those are not something that's upfront. By interest, it's very clear. I'm lending you $100 and you're paying me $110. So in other words, says the Gemara, that the 2, Gezela and Ainah, don't match up with Ribis, because Ribis has something the others don't have, which is knowledge. You have the knowledge that the issue is happening. So this is an instance where if you had the 2, you wouldn't be able to learn the third, because the third has ingredients. And again, the Gemara does this always, is when we try to hekish and we try to say that, we can learn one from the other. Why do you need it? You always have to find some kernel that suggests that it's different. And if it's different, you can't learn it out. So here, what's the common denominator? Gezel is surreptitious. Non-compliant. You don't agree to be the victim of a Gezel, and you don't agree to be the victim of Ainah. Ribis, you have a choice. You know perfectly well at the very outset. Okay, so it can't be those 2 and leaving out Ribis. What about Lo lichta v'rachmana lav ba'Ainah? So forget about ono. Let's say we didn't have a pasuk from ono. Would we be able to learn ono out from the other two? Says the Gemara, no. That you know what the common denominator is? That ono is a business. Is a business. Okay? And in a business, if you're not aware of all the nuances of the business, you can be fleeced, you can be taken. Masha Ein Kain, Gazel has nothing to do with business, and neither does Ribbis either, because in Ribbis, it would not necessarily have anything to do with a business transaction. I know it is by definition, but Ribbis isn't. Ribbis is simply one friend to the other, like we said earlier. I need a cup of sugar, okay, and I'll give you back a cup and a half. So we don't consider that business. That's not considered mekach or memker. So the distinction is that by mekach or memker, you have different halachas than you have by nan. So again, the Gemara is distinguishing that it has a trait that the other two doesn't have, is that I know is mekach memker and gezela and ribbis are not. So now we see that I know cannot be the. So what with? So let's drop gezel from the picture and leave just ribbis and I know, and let's see if we can learn it out from the other two, and we'll inherently learn gezel, right? The my parach, what's the kasha? In other words, what would be the problem? I know Turkey. So you're going to say, okay, that chidush, ribbis is a chidush, right? Because a person doesn't necessarily have to enter into that relationship. And in relationship, we say it's a chiddush that the love, remember the chiddush is in the love, that the borrower is over alav. That's the chiddush he's talking about. So therefore, and that chiddush doesn't apply by Oino and doesn't apply by Gezel. The victim of the fraud or of the Gezel is not a voluntary participant, so he never gets a lav. The participant of the borrower, who participates in ribbis, is over a lav. So we'll see mala ribbis shekain chiddush. Ribbis is a chiddush, right? Therefore, ono tachiach, right? So then we're going to ask and say that ono is shlugs it up. Mala ono shekain lo yodo machol. And if you're going to object, you're going to say that ono is a case where the victim doesn't even know, and therefore he has no havamina to be able to say, I don't want to participate, right? So, like we said, that can't be similar to Gezel. We're trying to understand why we can't drop the pasuk of Gezel. So the Gemara says you can't drop the pasuk of Gezel because if you're going to say that ribbis is going to be what is going to be the ikr, and therefore Gezel you can learn from it, that can't be, because Gezel is there's no isser on the victim, and by ribbis there's an isser on the victim. Then let's say maybe from Onor we can learn that you don't have Gezel. Why? Because, and we're going to say that by the case of Onor, he isn't knowledgeable of what's going on. Gezel, it's upfront. A person is being robbed, and therefore, you'll say, okay, that's the issue. So once again, you can't learn Gezel from Ribbis, and you can't learn it from Onor. So therefore, Gezel can't be the odd man out as far as the psukim go. Right? Again, so the Gemara uses this expression that you can't line them up in such a way that we would learn one from the other, regardless. So we see that Gezel is a standalone, and Einor is a standalone, and Ribbis is a standalone, because each one have properties that the other one doesn't have, and therefore you can't learn out. In other words, we call that, if something is on all fours, then we say, okay, I can completely learn something out because it is identical. There's nothing identical between Gezel and Oino and Ribbis. They all have different inherent qualities that make them forbidden. Hatzara Shava Shebehem. What is the Tzara Shava? Okay, so one slugs the other up. What is the Tzara Shava? What is the commonality of all of them? Shekain Gozlo. Because what? Because in a sense, you're robbing, right? Now, Gezel is Beferish robbery, but I know is robbery because you're taking advantage of someone even without his knowledge. Ribbis, I'm desperate, I need the food, I'm willing to pay. But inherently, isn't that a form of robbery? I mean, in the loose sense, not that I'm being victimized by a Gezel, but I'm forced into something that I don't want to do, and I have to pay up. So that's a form of Gezel. That's the Tzada Shava, Shekain Goslo, because you're taking something away. Therefore, Afani Avi Gezel, therefore I need Gezel to be a standalone on its own, because you couldn't necessarily learn the others from Gezel. How do you learn a forced robbery and say, oh, I'm going to learn ribbis from that? But the bottom line is that just like Gezel is taking away something from someone against his will, Oino is taking away something against his will, because he doesn't even know that he's being defrauded. And Gezel is taking someone else against his will, because remember, we have the word neshech, which means to bite. What does bite mean? That means you're hurting the borrower, neshech. You're hurting the borrower because he's forced into taking money from you, and therefore he has no brera, because the only way he can get the money is if he repays with interest. So therefore, the Gemara, interestingly, concludes that not only can you not learn one from the other, you can't learn two from one out of, in other words, learn two and the other will be covered too. Because oftentimes the Gemara says that fine, let's if there's a commonality, we'll learn two and the third will be understood. So the Gemara goes through this whole Shaklavitaria and says, no, 2 out of 3 doesn't work, because each one has a separate property that doesn't allow for it to be done. So Rashi says, Lomali la beribis la begezel, Yalamdu zeh mizeh. Let's learn one from the other. Shekula chisaron mammon, shemechasses kavero. There is a commonality that he has a chisaron mammon. He has a loss of money by force, by fraud, by ribis, but that there is a commonality, right? In other words, there is something to say that they all sort of fit the same picture. That's why the Gemara has a havamina to say, let's learn one without the other. But as the Gemara explains, each one has a separate nuance of its own that I couldn't learn out from the third pasuk. Therefore, I have to have all 3 pasukim in order to tell me that. Yeah, remember, by ribis, there was a novelty that even the lover is asar rachmana. But Gaza love shlo yitneno. He shouldn't take it. That's a chiddush. That the Torah is machadish. Velosha asa lachzas chavero b'derech acheres. Tohaz hara loive lav mishum lemechusahu. Because the forewarning on the love has nothing to do with the fact that he's going to be taken advantage of, right? Gezel, you have a victim. Or no, you have a victim. He's saying that the Yiddish is that by love, I wouldn't have known that a love should not borrow, that he gets an isser for borrowing, because I'm not going to extrapolate and say that he's saying the hashara love lav mishum lemechasahu. The hashara, the warning against the lover, is not the same as being victimized by a gezel or by a no. Therefore, by the love, by a ribis, it's truly a chiddush for us to understand that if a person borrows and has a need, that he's over a lav. Why would you even think that? That's not something that if not for the pasuk, I would never have thought that a love who's in a vulnerable position, even though he's doing an arm's length transaction, right? It isn't surreptitious and it isn't by force. I know what I'm doing. I see it, but I need the money. So if you need the money, okay, fine. Then why should you penalize the borrower because he needs the money? Okay, now but it's an ani, he needs the money, or food, or whatever it happens to be. So Rashi is pointing out that why it's a novelty, it's a chiddush. It's you can't say it's because he's being mechaser that he's losing something in the way that a gezel is a victim and Ainor is a victim. He wants to make a point that that's the chiddush, and that's a chiddush I would not have learned out from the other two. Right? These are so medat or no loy gezel al karchashakel. So therefore, I would distinguish that they have something in common that that Ribbis doesn't have in common. Tomer mekechel memker. Tomer shehiderach mekechel memker. V'yinesh be'adam tzrichen lekonim b'yoser mishioro. So he makes a valid point. I'm a collector, and I buy artifacts, and I know what I'm doing. So there are people who, without knowing the price, see something and say, this to me has a value. I love this. I'm happy to pay it. Turns out to be I know, but because he is someone who embraces it and said, I want this item, he's willing to pay more. So I know then has a different chiddush, is because you're dealing with people who, irrespective of the fact that it's more than a sixth, are happy to pay it. Ribbis, okay, you don't want to pay ribbis, you don't want to be the victim of gezel. But I know, why are you defrauding me if I am an arm's length buyer of something that I want to pay more for? The chiddush that there is I know, and again, the I know is not on the victim, but on the other fellow, is that he should be upfront and say, this is the price. But from the recipient standpoint, he has no havamina that he's overpaying, because this is something that he wants, and if he wants it, he has to pay more, right? So now the Rashi says, "Lo lichtach begezel v'tarte mahanach dechi parchta." If you're parachta, if you're going to ask mala ribish shekain chidush tomer begezel oino, right? Techiach mal oino shekain lo yoda demachol tomer begezel the yoda. Right. So in other words, each one of them slugs up the other, because if you're going to find commonality with Oino, then what about Gezel? So if you wanted to learn Oino and Gezel and Ribbis, then none of the three are literally identical to each other. So you can always distinguish one factor and say, you can't learn this out because this factor exists here and it doesn't exist there. So the Gemara is very logical in that it sort of to track through and understand that each issue is standard price to it that don't apply, that don't appear in other cases. So therefore, you can't just lump together and say, "Oh yeah, I can learn it because it's close enough." Close enough is not something that the Gemara tells us is a way of thinking. It has to be identical. Okay, learn the machal toma begezel the other veikala meimar demiyayish or machal, that he is miyayish and he's moichel, and he says, I need it, therefore I'm willing to pay for it. Ribbis techiach, then ribbis will be a kasha, because in ribbis, if a person needs something desperately and you tell him you got to pay me something for it, what's he going to say? I'll pass on the food because I have to give you back something more. Of course he won't. So it's called miyayish. He basically gives up and says, it's okay. I don't need it. So, and because by ribbis you can't be miyayish, therefore we're saying by anor you also can't be miyayish. Even though there might be someone who's willing to pay more for an object, the Gemara is telling us we're protecting him against himself, that he shouldn't have to pay more. Why? Because the person's defrauding him. Even though he might otherwise, if we willing to pay for something that he wants, the Gemara is protecting him and saying you can't do it. Okay, that's a very interesting svara. Is that it's not totally a free market that you can do anything you want. In commerce, there are specific laws to protect each other and for on both sides, right? I mean, a seller can also be defrauded, thinking that he's making a nice profit and he's well below what he should be charging. So the Gemara is protecting, in the case of Oino, the seller. And in the case of Ribbis, for instance, we're protecting the buyer by telling him you can't enter into a deal that is going to pay Ribbis, even though you need that product or the money, whatever it happens to be. So the commonality is that you're losing something. Right? Whether you're losing money or an object or food, you're losing something. So that's the commonality. Therefore, of a gezel, therefore I have to bring gezel in. The gezel is also losing something. All right. So what we leave from this Gemara is very, very interesting, is that Chazal, when they set up the system of Ribbis and Oino and gezel and Mekech and Memker and all the various things, it was done with a precision we don't appreciate. We have this wonderful commerce system here in countries where there's rules and regulations, what you can do, what you can't. But somehow when we turn back the time to the Tanoim, we think, it was kind of hefker. And we see that in other cases where we ask Akasha, what did they have in mind? I mean, what was the real thinking behind it? The teretz is that we have courts of law and courts of equity, and sometimes it's the strict construction of the law, and sometimes it's equity. The Torah doesn't have that. The Torah says that when a bezdin has to judge, it has to judge bedin u'berachmona. In other words, there has to be a midas hadin and a midas harachamim. Why? Because the Rabbanan Shalom has a midas hadin and a midas harachamim. So we see sometimes, as in this case, we protect someone against himself because he'd be more than willing to do something. But the Torah says, no, we're not going to let you do that because that's someone taking advantage. So what has to happen? In commerce, the lender then has to say, okay. And by the way, that's the whole point of Heter Iska, is that we're going to allow the lender to make something, but we're not going to call it ribbis. Okay, so you could say that's. I'm involved in a deal that someone is going to require that I make a certain payment, and in that payment, I've got to pay him. I've got to pay him for a fee, whatever that fee is. It's not totally on the loan. It's not totally on the actual business transaction. It's a fee because he has expenses, etc., etc. The Torah never said that a person should lend money and lose money, right? And we see that in the examples we gave earlier, right? I don't have to give you a lawnmower and you use it, and now I'm chesaron kiss because now I have to fill it up with gas and I have to do other things. No, it's shava b'shava. So the system that the Gemara incorporates is really a balance between a person who has a need and a person who has the ability to solve the need, except with some gezel, of course, where a person who's a robber, that's quite different than a person in defrauding in business or ribbis. But nevertheless, need to tell us we wouldn't know gezel for the other because gezel has different properties than the other two. So that's how the Gemara comes here. And Mitzvah next week, we're going to go into more detail, breaking down what is gezel. The Gemara now wants to get into more a deep understanding of what these things are. But for our purposes, the Gemara concludes that each one is a standalone and they all have their own validity, and one can't be learned from the other. All right, so we'll stop here.